We're back in Mark 8. We are going to do the last portion of Mark 8, but let's kind of get ramped up to where we were a little bit. We had the feeding of the 4,000. Remember the feeding of the 5,000 earlier, now the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark 8. And Jesus brought out, the boys were having trouble understanding, and we're going to see a little more about that in 14 when we hit it. But he brings out, this is from Skip Heitzig, I thought brought it out pretty good, where Jesus emphasized the number of baskets of bread that were left over when he fed the 5,000 and when he fed the 7,000. And let me highlight this in a shared screen because we're so high tech. All right, so we see the differences there between the 5,000 and the 4,000 in the right two columns there. If you look on the yellow highlighted areas on the leftovers, you got 12 baskets. And that seems to indicate Old Testament law, 12 tribes of Israel. And then we've got the feeding of the 7,000. Remember, the 5,000 was the audience was Jewish, totally Jewish. Feeding of the 4,000 was a mixture of Jews and Gentiles. So it was a mix of everybody. And there were 7 baskets left over. And according to Skip Heitzig, it seems very much on purpose that the 12 tribes of Israel represent the law that was given, and then the 4,000, which was given to the Gentiles, 7 baskets left over, relate to and provide gospel to the 7 Gentile nations that were kicked out of Canaan. Those were the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Girgashites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and the Satellites. Sorry, the Satellites was a joke, number 8 there. Sorry. That was a 20th century joke. But it's interesting. Of course, I'd never ever seen that before, but it does seem to kind of fit. So they are the boys are coming out of. He went to the area of Dalmanutha, which is not mentioned anywhere else in Scripture, but that's where they were. And let me pull this off of sharing. Stop the sharing. There we go. And so they were in that region, and here come the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees were they had to make a trip to meet him there. And what was that term that we used as the rhythm is getting faster several weeks ago? It's been 4 weeks ago, maybe now. That rhythm that's getting faster and faster as he's marching to the cross. You guys remember that musical? Larry when you need musicals? Where's Larry when you want him? I know it. I believe it was. I thought of it last night. I just knew I'd remember it.
Yeah, all that comes to my mind is a climactic drum roll.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. But anyway, that's what's going on here, and we're going to see him seemingly kind of control that here in just a minute. Let's go ahead and I think we read this last time we were together, but this will kind of tie it up to where we are now. So if Dad, would you read 11 and 12 and 13?
11, 12, and 13.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Then I'll have a question after this.
Oh, uh-oh. Oh, sorry. We're out of time. We gotta go.
And the Pharisees came forth and began to question with him, seeking of him a sign from heaven, tempting him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and saith, why doth this generation seek after a sign? Verily I say unto you, there shall no sign be given unto this generation. And he left them, and entering into the ship, again departed to the other side.
Of course, it didn't really matter what he did, because I mean they'd already seen miracles and whatnot, but the wording here does indicate that they were looking for like a prediction of future kind of a thing. And but he had said it before, and he's about to really get into it to tell exactly what's going to happen into the future, but he wasn't going to tell them in detail what was going on. I'll go ahead and ask you, what was your question, sir?
Okay. We've been through the part about feeding of the 5,000 and feeding of the 4,000 and how many baskets was left over and all that. Do we have any indication what happened to the leftovers?
There is not, but we're going to see where one piece of bread made it. But it's almost because they definitely picked it up. They just didn't leave it on the ground, did they? And I wonder if the people took it, but we're going to have an indication in 14 that they had forgotten to bring bread with them in the boat. So that's a good question, and I haven't seen any indication of what happened to it. Good question. Good question. Yep. And those are the type of questions that a lot of times we do a little mining and we get some pretty good gold out of. So yeah, that's the type of question we want. Absolutely. 14 and 15, Andrew, please, sir.
All right. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod.
Now, if you're one of the disciples, you got to be thinking, okay, is he mad about bread? I don't know. What does it have to do with what's going on? But he obviously he used the bread as leaven, and leaven is always what? Not always. I can't say always, because there are some instances where leaven is not used negatively, but typically leaven is used negatively as sin that grows, right? But Jesus
Like
used,
adding yeast,
Say again?
like adding yeast to bread.
Is
It'll
it
make
not-
it get thicker, but it's not going to last as long.
Oh, gotcha. Yep. Yeah, and I'm going to trust you on that one. Does bread with yeast in it not last as long?
Well, no, because yeast is a live bacteria. That's what causes the bread to mold. So when they didn't leaven something, they didn't add yeast to it.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, it wouldn't allow it to expand and it wouldn't deteriorate as fast.
I'll go with that, but it's just not as good with butter.
Yeah, but it's pretty good when you wrap ham up into it.
Oh, okay. All right. Jesus used the bread discussion as a launching point into a warning about the Pharisees, and in particular, in this case, Herod Antipas. In the Matthew version of this, which I believe is in Matthew 16, he says the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And it takes a little digging to kind of get what he's getting at here. So And is it 16 or 15? Let's see. I want to make sure. Sorry. Let's see. It is 16. I'll change my notes here real quick. But the disciples missed the launch altogether, so it's okay, as anybody would. I think we would have missed it, and I've missed it all my life. But the leaven is often used as a metaphor of sin, of course, and it's working through the body. And so in this case, the sin was thinking that the Messiah would be a political figure. That's the crust here. Notice the bread analogy here. That's the crust. All right. Yes, got it. And so he mentions Herod Antipas and whatnot. So Jesus was probably warning of following a political figure or a political mantra rigorously. The Pharisees perceived the Messiah as a Mishnah following zealot for the Jews who would free them from Rome. The Sadducees probably viewed the Messiah from a political position, because the Sadducees didn't really pay much attention to the Mishnah. And you guys remember what the Mishnah is, right? Those 613 additional little laws that the Pharisees kind of made up, or at least the teachers did. And the Sadducees didn't really care about the Mishnah so much, but they did care about the law, and they were pretty positive toward Rome. They kind of followed what Rome wanted them to do. But they still wanted power. Herod Antipas was purely into it for political manipulation. Remember, he wanted Jesus to do a trick for him, to do a miracle. I mean, he was just like entertainment to him. And I'm sure it seems from the personality of Herod Antipas that if he could have gotten Jesus under his thumb, he would have used him for political purposes, for his own power. And yet, all that, we got the Pharisees, the Sadducees, Herod Antipas, and Jesus seems to have mentioned here, or in Matthew. And then you got the disciples who were still thinking about the bread. So, I'm probably with the disciples at this point. I would not have gotten what Jesus was getting at, for sure.
Were the disciples quite haphazard?
Seemed like it. And they weren't. And Jesus is just about to be on to them for saying, and he'll say, you've got ears, but you're not hearing. You've got eyes, but you're not seeing. Why don't you understand yet? And so he's getting a little frustrated with them, seemingly. So let's take a look at 16 to 21. Doug, would you do that, please, sir?
And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand?
All right, so there it is again, the 12 baskets and 7 baskets. And we all wish that conversation was continued. And because the disciples probably go, oh yeah, we get it. They probably didn't get it yet. Come on. We wish that somebody would have been strong enough to have said, no, I'm sorry, we still don't get it. Could you explain it further? That would have been so nice. But they were probably so embarrassed at this point that, yeah, we get that, sure. Anyway, but we're like that too, right? 21 sets up an imagery for the moment that's about to happen with a two-stage healing of a blind man. And so I'm going to ask Dad to read 22 and 23.
And he cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. And when he had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught.
Okay. So in 22, we see a guy in Bethsaida. And how does the blind guy get to Jesus?
He was brought in by others.
He was brought in by somebody. So in chapter 7, a fellow was brought to Jesus who was deaf, and he was brought in by somebody. Back in chapter, I forgot what chapter, 2? It was early on. We saw where some friends ripped off Peter's house roof and lowered him down. So he was brought to Jesus by some friends. And so it seemed like, I can't remember who said this, but that's a pretty good picture of intercessory prayer, where we bring people to Jesus, not just in action and in prayer, where intercession seems to be really important for people who are deaf and blind spiritually, to be brought in.
That was
Chapter 2. Chapter 2. I forgot. Yeah, I remember it was early on. So yeah. So friends led them to Jesus. In 23, let's see here. In both the deaf man in 7 and the blind man in 8, Jesus led them away from the crowd before healing them. And there was a guy by the name of John Jenkins, I thought was really good. He said, typologically, people can only gain sight if they are brought to Jesus. The world will provide many solutions to people's problems, but unless it starts with Jesus, it's just a matter of the blind leading the blind. Why did Jesus lead the man away from the people? Typologically, if you're going to change, you'll probably have to leave some people behind. That was I think, Doug, you can probably speak to that. I mean, when your life changed, you had to leave some people behind, did you not?
Well, definitely.
Yeah.
I also had to bring some new people into my life too.
Oh, true. True. Yep. Yep. 24.
I think,
go ahead.
I was just going to add on that. The way my commentary writes it,
Yeah.
I like the way it was written, because it says Jesus led the blind man out of the village, perhaps to be away from the elements of unbelief and hostility.
I can see that. Yeah. Yep. 24 to 26, Andrew.
All right. And the man looked up and said, I can see people, but they look like trees walking. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, do not even go into the village.
All right. There's a pretty good answer here. In fact, there are, I think, 2 fairly good answers. do you guys have any answers as to why Jesus would have a two-stage healing? You would think that if Jesus touched your eyes in any way, shape, or form, they would be healed immediately. But obviously, there's a good reason for a two-stage approach in this one instance. You have any thoughts on that? I had never heard this before, but it's pretty good. I wanted to share it with you, but I'll give you a shot.
Have anything to do with doubt?
I heard that concept where the blind man didn't have enough faith, maybe, and when he saw a little bit, his faith grew, and Jesus was able to heal him. I saw that. It didn't seem as good as these other two that hit it really, really well. Anybody else? But yeah, I did see that concept, Andrew.
So that if there was any doubt whatsoever,
Mm.
that would reaffirm it.
Yeah, that kind of goes with the first doubt, faith kind of a thing. Yeah, I don't really
But
discount
then
it.
that puts more emphasis on the blind man and not on Jesus. So
Yeah.
that can't.
Yeah.
I won't say it can't be it, but
Yeah. Here's what I thought was really good. Yeah, I think a fellow by the name of Alistair Roberts brought it up. This is, again, it's another typism done very much on purpose by Jesus. And it was set up again by the question back in 21. What did he say back in 21? He said, and he said to them, "Do you not yet understand?" These guys had seen tons of miracles already. They had been converted. They believed in Jesus, but they were still growing, and still coming to fruition as a Christian. They're still being sanctified is really what it is. So so it's a matter of our spiritual eyes being opened initially, and we're just babes in Christ. And we see some spiritual activity. We understand things spiritually now to a point, but yet we don't see it clearly. We won't truly see it clearly until after our faith is sight, as they say, with Christ. But we're continually in this sanctification mode of our eyes are getting clearer and clearer and clearer as we grow spiritually. And I thought that was a good concept and a good reason for Jesus to give a two-stage healing. The disciples had seen many things, and they were converted, so to speak, but they weren't seeing things clearly. And Jesus made that very well known. Don't you understand yet? Are you? You're not seeing things clearly yet. Let's see. The world will probably. Let's see. I'm going on to my other lesson here. Someday will be completely healed. In addition, it's also possible, according to this Mr. Roberts, that the reference to trees walking may have been prophetic in that most of the disciples would end up on crosses. And so, when somebody went to the cross, they would carry part of the cross, the cross beam over their shoulder, or somehow all the way to the cross. And he said that the trees walking could have been a prophetic point that many of them would be crucified as well. According to Ethan Boyard, the partial healing for sight could be typological of our spiritual healing, where we begin to understand, well, it's pretty much the same thing, where we begin to understand but don't fully understand. And what's about to happen here is that Peter is about to be commended, and then he's about to be condemned, or at least rebuked for something he did. So he still didn't understand. He still didn't fully grasp what was going on. And so with sanctification, our eyes, our spiritual eyes, become more clear. 27 and 20, any comments on that? I hope I made that clearer than trees walking as men.
The last sentence on verse 26. I thought it was interesting. He tells the man that was just healed of his sight, said, neither go into the town nor tell to any in the town. So that means the town folks were going to come out to see the blind man, or who had been blind, or he was not to go to town.
That's an interesting point. I wonder if it's because of who he had been hanging around with, bad influence, or was he trying to control the rhythm toward the cross, where if he went back into town, people would have made such a fuss over him. Hey, let's go make him king right now. And it would have been too early for anything to happen. Two possibilities. Yeah.
Okay.
Certainly. Yeah. 27 through 30, Dad.
Again,
is it your turn? Doug, did you go last?
No.
You didn't.
I think I did.
Think you did? Doug, it's your turn. Dad, you're off. Okay.
What do you want? What verses?
Oh, and he wasn't listening. Oh, I'll tell you.
I heard 27.
27 to 30. Yep, sorry. 27 30.
30. Okay. And Jesus went with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And he asked them, but who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are Christ. And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him.
So we see this again. According to Skip Heitzig, there's a dividing line between verse 26 and verse 27, where, and the scholars call this the continental divide of the Gospels. Prior to this point, Jesus has been ministering to the masses. But now he's going to be focused on the disciples. And so these are the last moments. He's focusing on the disciples now for very important reasons, because of the accelerando rhythm toward the cross. And there's that word, cha-ching, accelerando. Thank you, Larry. And this is arguable, but in 27, Jesus seems to again being showing his, I'll say this carefully, self-limited knowledge. He's limiting himself for a purpose. He's asking the guys, what are people saying? How's my rhythm toward the cross? I think that's a good possibility, because we can limit what we know. We have the capability of knowing things, but we limit what we know sometimes. And I think it's for our purpose, so that he can identify with us better. It's arguable, but anyway, he's maintaining a proper rhythm to the cross, a proper accelerando. 30, Peter's answer seems to have been right on target, obviously. And Jesus told people not to say anything at this time, when they had encountered the truth, because he didn't say, Peter, you're right, good job, or anything. It's just obvious. He says, all right, don't tell anybody. And it's still, we're in the don't tell zone temporarily. 31 now, Dad. Would you do 31, please, sir?
And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again.
In Matthew 16:17, Jesus goes on and gives Peter more accommodation at this point. He says, and Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And so Peter gets a pat on the back at this point, and actually he goes on, and you're going to be the rock, and I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So Peter really gets the pat on the back in Matthew in this regard. And then Jesus starts speaking very plainly about what's going to happen. And it's the first time that Jesus speaks plainly about his death, at this plainly. And there are 3 times in Mark when this happens, in chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10. And each time the boys don't seem to get it. But we got to appreciate the fact that he's been speaking in parables for so long, and then he starts speaking plainly, and it's probably thrown him for a loop. Is he talking? Is this a story? You know, it's got to be a little confusing to him. Yeah, you got to admit. He uses Son of Man in 31. Where as a title, and this comes from Daniel 7, 13 and 14, prophesying his and associating himself with the Messiah. In addition, this is really cool. He says, who's going to do it? He'll be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. So he is not saying that some random, out of control mob is going to cause his death. He's saying that the most morally conscious, upstanding, intelligent people on the planet are going to put him to death. This is crazy talk. This is crazy talk. And so Peter's about to set him straight. So Doug, would you read 32?
And he said this plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him.
All right. So Peter doesn't like what he's saying, and according to the theologians, the verbiage, the words used when Peter took him aside and rebuked him, it was pretty stern. Stop it! Don't say that's not going to happen on my watch, kind of stuff, and pretty rough. And you can kind of understand, because that wasn't Peter's understanding of how things were supposed to roll, you know, because a Messiah is not supposed to die on a cross. That's silly talk, you know. However, in Jesus is about to rebuke him publicly, even though Peter rebuked him privately. He's about to go public with it because he's probably figuring that everybody else is thinking the same thing. And so Jesus is going to go public. 33, Doug. No, let's see, Andrew. Andrew, it's your turn.
But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things."
All right, this was a big deal. If it was a minor issue, Jesus probably would have laughed it off and moved on and said, "Peter, I'm sorry, but you don't understand." But Peter was supposed to be the head of the new church, and now he's being used by Satan very clearly. And it's to tempt Jesus not to go through with it in the way that it's supposed to roll out. And it must have struck a chord in Jesus, because Jesus was tempted by Satan in the desert for 40 days. And then it's severe enough of what Peter did that it's where Satan was allowed into Peter's mind enough to cause Peter to take action to rebuke Christ and to tempt him in the rebuke not to go through with it. And Jesus hits it head on. And, it's got to be tough. David Platt brought out that the agony on the cross, and Jesus knew that was coming. The agony on the cross wasn't from the cross or the cat and nine tails or any other physical torture. The agony came from taking the full wrath of God against every sin committed against God. And that had to be just overwhelmingly difficult for Jesus. And so anybody who would bring temptation not to take that, what he knew he had to take, had to be tough. Had to be tough. Another commentator said that Peter put himself, in a sense, above Jesus to straighten him out. If you rebuke somebody, you're putting yourself above them to straighten them out. And he said that the fastest way to become like Satan is to try to become like God. And in a sense, that's what Peter did temporarily. Any of us would, if you cared for Jesus, Satan was allowed a way in there. All right, 34. This is a tough area. I'll hopefully be able to land the plane here. But Doug, would you read 34 through 38?
And calling the crowd to him with his disciples, he said to them, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? For what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me, of my words, in his adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels."
Taking up your cross. That's it's concrete, but it's very nebulous in a way. Number one, we don't have crosses here, so you got to think, what in the world is that? So Jesus says we need to take up our cross and follow him. Back then, obviously, that was a dirty word. The only ones who took up a cross were murderers and thieves. And so when he said, "Take up your cross," they had to think, "What? Yeah, we're not on Rome's side right now, but they don't love us, but I don't think they're going to put anybody on the cross for, what we're healing people. That's ridiculous." But Jesus answers it with what theologians call the four fours. The four fours, FOUR, FORS, the four fours. So number one, whoever will save his own life will lose it. For number two, whoever loses his life for Christ and the gospel will save it. And so the word for life in this situation, and this may be the big takeaway from the lesson tonight, the word for life here is not the Greek word zoe for physical life, but rather the word psyche, meaning our identity. So whoever loses his psyche, loses his identity for me, will gain it, will gain life. So we give our whole identity to Christ is the idea. The third four we're looking at here is, what if you gain the whole world and lose your soul? The fourth four that he used was, whoever is ashamed of Jesus and his words, he'll be ashamed of them. So therefore, how do we take up our cross? We sacrifice our identity to Christ in three areas: denying the world's definition of success, which turns out to include the instinctual drive to gain possessions at the expense of seeking and serving the Lord. And we could look at Matthew 6:33, but seek first his kingdom and his seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. The second point of how we sacrifice our identity to Christ is by publicly and unashamedly sharing Christ and the gospel, being willing to lose everything for it. And the third way is following Jesus' example of asking for what you want, but ultimately saying, not my will, but yours. That's what Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. Lord, what I really want to avoid is that cross thing. But if you want me to go through it, your will be done. So, you have to ask yourself, does it mean that we should all enter full-time vocational ministry, forsaking any kind of secular gifts he's given to us? And the answer would be no. First of all, we're all in full-time ministry. And but we need to use the abilities he's given us to honor him and not focus our abilities on gaining material possessions. And so that's the crust of it. I think giving up our identity to the Lord and focusing on what he would desire of our lives and not on what would do best for us in our minds always, that's taking up our cross. Sounds easier than it is. So we're landing the plane at 2 minutes till. Not bad.